All right, so I don't know what that was all about. I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Professor Julia Haas of Rhodes College. Julia was also a McDonald postdoc in PNP, so this is like Sarah, in some ways a return to home for her.
Same feelings.
With the same feelings of being kind of with your family and doing the talk, so to speak. Julia works on a number of topics in the philosophy of neuroscience and cognitive science, moral psychology, neuroethics, and has a number of great pieces of work. A lot of her work has been about the weakness of will, which is a major puzzle in philosophy, and trying to look at empirical work on cognitive control, and to try to resolve this puzzle. So she has a recent paper on the empirical resolution to the puzzle of weakness of the will. She has also done work on learning in theories of moral learning, and also some work on the nature of moral value and whether that's a different kind of thing or the same kind of thing as other forms of valuation, and generally work on reinforcement learning theory and values. So today, Professor Haas is going to talk to us about V is for valuation.
Thanks, Joe, for that sweet introduction. It's really nice to be back. And thanks to you, Ben and Emily. I really enjoyed this workshop. So some of you who know me know that I work a lot on issues in reinforcement learning and how reinforcement learning approaches can be used kind of in the sense that Sarah was describing earlier, in sort of a neurophilosophical approach. How can we use reinforcement learning to solve traditional problems in philosophy, and particularly in the philosophy of mind? And so I've typically taken a kind of case-by-case approach. I've taken a puzzle and tried to resolve it using the reinforcement learning toolkit. On the occasion of a cognitive ontology workshop, I'm going to try and say something a little bit stronger and a little bit broader. I'm going to try and make the case that in light of the successes of generally the reinforcement learning framework, a construct I'm going to call valuation, which draws on the core concepts of reinforcement learning, deserves a place in the traditional or received philosophical cognitive ontology. So reinforcement learning is a powerful frame of thought, and philosophy has not taken it up. And so what I'm going to try and do is make the case for taking up valuation, as I'm going to call it, within this traditional framework. So in traditional philosophical theories, we kind of characterize the mind in information processing terms. So that's to say that we think of the mind as doing things like parsing sensory information, generating perception, engaging in the kinds of cognitive processes that Russ was referring to yesterday as like the interesting ones, right? Reasoning, decision-making, inferring, right? And where appropriate, acting on some of these lower level processes, right? And so we can think of it in very general terms as kind of like we have this general theoretical interest in what the mind does, and we characterize this notion of information processing as kind of a general basket or umbrella term, where we think of the mind as doing things like sensing, inferring, kind of generally trying to figure out what it is that's going on in the world. We might be better at that, we might be worse, but what the mind is in the business of doing is kind of learning about what is going on in the world in various ways, right? And these kind of traditional interests, I think, lead to, this is a very basic start that I will then refine, a very basic philosophical cognitive ontology, right? We think of the mind in information processing terms. We start with some of the following building blocks. We think of the mind as engaged in sensations. We can call a sensation something like the processes that happen at the beginning of our sensory systems, right? We think of the mind as engaging in perception. So we think of the mind as being able to allow us to have experiences like seeing or hearing. We think of the mind as engaging in cognitive processes in this narrower sense of things like reasoning, understanding, and knowledge. And then we also think of the mind as engaging in what we can more narrowly call motor cognition, right? So planning, preparing, producing actions, and things like this. Now, why am I emphasizing this basic cognitive ontology? I think it's because I want to highlight the sort of theoretical or epistemic nature of how we typically think of parceling the mind. We often think of the mind in these theoretical terms. And obviously the picture that I'm putting up here is really simple, and there are lots of amendments that we want to make kind of set it up in these kind of basic terms before I say something kind of more detailed about it. So this is kind of the basic build. These are the basic building blocks, I think, particularly in kind of traditional philosophy of mind, and then lots of philosophers of the kinds of like-minded philosophers that we might find in this room have come along and said, look, this is way too basic. There are some really important amendments that we're going to want to make to this basic ontology, basic philosophical ontology. And so obviously, just right off the bat, even just from what we've heard over the past couple of days, right, we don't want to just include sensation and perception. We're going to want to include memory, attention, cognitive control. So the number of boxes that we have in our cognitive ontology are going to expand. But that's just kind of the first step. The second thing that we're going to want to realize, and this goes to many of the talks that we've heard here today, is that the boundaries between these processes is not clear at all. So if you take something very simple like the perception-cognition divide and you look at that debate in the philosophical literature, you realize that just saying, oh, the mind is engaged in perception and the mind is engaged in cognition is an enormously complicated issue, and it's not clear how we should draw the boundaries over that kind of question. So again, our picture is becoming richer. Another common kind of feature, and I think this starts to get at this sort of theoretical or epistemic emphasis that we often have when we build a cognitive ontology, is people start to look at this and they say, hey, this is a little bit too theory-driven or a little bit too kind of epistemically minded. We do lots of things that don't involve knowing or perceiving. We feel things, right? We value things. We have kind of phenomenological experiences of affect and mood, and often the way that this kind of revision to the cognitive ontology has been framed is in terms of emotion, right? You get these debates where people are saying, look, emotion is really undervalued by philosophers, but we should include it because it can account for a lot of the experiences that we think are really important, right? And there are lots of other ways that we can kind of take the basic picture and refine it. There are all kinds of amendments that we can make. We can look at prospection, for example, and say, no, really what the mind is in the business of doing is prospecting rather than passively receiving. And we can look at meta-theoretical issues of the kind that Carl was talking about earlier today, right? So there are all kinds of ways that you take this basic picture and you enrich it. But what I want to suggest is that maybe this value-free aspect of information processing is something that gets carried through even into what I'm going to call the received philosophical cognitive ontology, the one with all these amendments, right? This richer picture still carries over some of these kind of original philosophical interests of being interested in how the mind knows about the world, and in order to know about the world, perceives the world, but has these kind of strong theoretical drafts. And what I want to do today is I want to take this received philosophical ontology and I want to introduce a new process into it. So I kind of want to put another box in there. But in the process of doing that, I think maybe we can start to shift what we think of as the mind, what the mind is doing in terms of this information processing. It may not just be knowing about the world. It may be in the business of doing something like continually assessing the world, continually evaluating the world. And that is something that we might want to think about when we think about, okay, what is it that the mind is doing? So what I want to do, as I suggest, is I want to introduce the notion of valuation. And this is going to be a construct that I kind of developed from a lot of the reinforcement learning literature, and basically how I want to proceed is as follows. I want to say, look, valuation is something that you should take seriously, right? This is something that deserves a place at the table, particularly at the philosophical table where I think it's been excluded. And the way that I want to proceed here is to start by saying, okay, here is a positive characterization that I think philosophers can get on board with. So I want to develop what that notion of valuation is, and then I want to say, okay, now that we have kind of a toehold, maybe we have a place at the table, we say, okay, maybe we can take this as something that we might want to think about. I want to spend the latter half of my talk describing, okay, what place does it deserve in this cognitive ontology? Is it just kind of something that can be at the table? Is it something that can really impact a lot of the constructs that we already have in our cognitive ontology? And this is going to be more of an open-ended empirical question of, okay, what place do we want to attribute to valuation in this traditional philosophical ontology? Okay, so this roughly follows my plan. First, I'm going to describe what valuation is. I'm going to start with an example and kind of build it up to give a characterization of valuation. I'm going to describe a little bit how this issue relates to the formal models or the computational models of reinforcement learning, and then I'm going to go on to kind of try and assess valuation's place in the ontology. And like Chandra, I think if you have any questions, you can feel free to just sort of tea talk style ask me. on the way. Okay, so in some ways, Chandra and I were talking about this earlier, this is a funny project to be taking on because it draws on a field known as reinforcement learning, which is a branch of AI research that has had enormous success everywhere roughly but philosophy over the past 20 years. And so in some ways, it's a kind of funny project to try and introduce a concept that is already really influential in other domains and try and pitch it to your own kind of home discipline and say, hey, this has worked really well for other disciplines and I think it can also do positive sort of philosophical work. And so if you're computationally inclined, a lot of the kind of constructs and processes that I'm going to be describing are going to be familiar to you, but I want to kind of develop them in a way that I think philosophers can kind of find useful. And in that process, we'll also see how that initial idea changes a little bit. So the basic idea in reinforcement learning is that it's sort of a normative project trying to figure out how an agent can learn in the environment or learn by interaction with the environment. There's a basic problem. We as learners, right, we don't come with a full kind of program of the environment figuring out, okay, I already know I have a training set and I learned how to deal with this. What we have to do as learners is continually figure out how to solve problems just by sort of bumping around in the world, right? This is called unsupervised learning, where we don't have a complete map of kind of our environment. And what reinforcement learning does, kind of as a research program, is to figure out, okay, what strategies can an agent use in order to kind of bootstrap and learn from the environment? So this is kind of the general problem that they're trying to solve. And basically what happens is that you get kind of a set of solutions for how you can learn through interactions with the environment. And it's a very kind of theoretical research program in artificial intelligence until roughly 1996 and 1997, when this is a finding many people will be familiar with. We come to discover that one of the algorithms, one of the solutions proposed by reinforcement learning, the temporal difference learning algorithm, actually makes incredibly nice predictions about the firing of dopamine in the mammalian brain. Right? So we have a purely theoretical research project, and then it turns out to be really nicely predictive of what creatures like us are actually doing, and it kind of gains a foothold not just in this idealized world, but actually in the world of neuroscience, and we get kind of this explosion of computational neuroscience, right? And I don't want to get into kind of the whole impact of what reinforcement learning has done. I just kind of want to suggest it has been really influential. I put Uber up here just because one of the original authors of this paper now works at Uber, and I think that's kind of a nice illustration of how productive and how useful people find reinforcement learning frameworks. It works. The models work to the point that we might trust someone like Peter Diane to start modeling our driverless cars, right? So if you can't tell the whole history of reinforcement learning, you can say, hey, it seems to capture dopamine, catches on, it's kind of this enormously productive research project for 20 years, and now it's kind of got this translational aspect where someone like a company like Uber is going to take these people on, or Google Mind is starting to take these projects on and finding them enormously productive. So again, it's kind of I'm in a funny position where I want to say, hey, reinforcement learning is really influential, but it has no uptake in philosophy, almost at all. And so I have two exceptions here, near and dear to my heart. Tim Schroeder's 3 Faces of Desire. He also looked at this research program and said, hey, I think this can solve a lot of problems in philosophy. He has kind of channeled that work through his understanding of desire. And also Peter Railton has worked a lot on reinforcement learning approaches to moral learning. But we saw toes on feet earlier. You can kind of take this citation and say, hey, I can count the number of people who have taken up this research program on not just one hand, but on two fingers. Why is that, right? And we were talking a little bit about why that's the case. It's certainly not that, philosophers don't like computational approaches. Philosophers love computational approaches, and they particularly love predictive processing, right? I'm pretty sure everyone in this room has probably read this paper about predictive processing, or you've read Jacob Howey's book, or Clark's book, or something like this. And I think the reason for that is is that we already have a long-term kind of relationship with Bayes' theorem in philosophy, and also because predictive processing, again, gets at that kind of information processing or perceptual or knowledge-based problem of the mind knowing about the world, and predictive processing is one way of cashing that out. Whereas machine learning is kind of in a different tradition, and it answers a different kind of question, and it may just not be as familiar to us. And so the question is, how can we have success like predictive processing has for something like reinforcement learning, or should we, right? Obviously, I want to make the case that we should take reinforcement learning on and that we should take valuation seriously, but we want to see kind of what the compare and the contrast would be with a research project like that that Andy Clark has put forward, right? So I think the way to go about it, my strategy, and this is something that I would be curious to hear about from you, is what's the best way to introduce a concept like this? I don't think it's by just telling people about how effective reinforcement learning frameworks are. I think the idea is we want to take this as a process that occurs in the mind that then happens to be really well described by reinforcement learning frameworks. And so what I want to do is I want to develop kind of an example of something that we know the mind does, show how that's an instance of valuation, and develop kind of a general characterization. So that will give us kind of a construct that we can work with, that we can put on the table, and then we can assess whether we want to include it into our cognitive ontology or not. And if we do, kind of to what extent we want to do that. So the problem, kind of the example that I want to develop here is just the basic problem of how the mind solves the task of learning where and when to look. Right? So this is a task that we all take for granted. It's very simple. We're all doing it right now, but it's actually a really complicated problem. How does your brain or your mind decide where you're looking at any given moment? And the evidence suggests that even though it is really complicated, we're actually really good at this. So it looks like what we do when we're looking at stuff is we look at things that are task relevant. So maybe you're looking at me, maybe not, depends on the task that you're doing. We do this in the order that we need to be doing it, and we look at things just in time. And so the example that often gets used here is here you have a picture of a participant who gets asked to make a sandwich and a pot of tea. Now this is relevant because if you look at this picture, you'll notice that the participant, and they're tracking eye movement here and fixation points, the participant is actually not looking at the salient gingham tablecloth at all. The participant is looking at the items needed to make the tea and the items needed to make the sandwich, and she looks at them in the correct order, and she looks at them just in time. So she looks at the spout just before she pours it into the cup of tea. And you can see this also really nicely with elite athletes. So Ronaldo doesn't ever look at the soccer ball, right? They've done studies like this with him. He doesn't look at the soccer ball, as you might guess. He looks like 5 moves ahead. He's not even looking at the players, right, that he's about to weasel past. Next, he's like way past that. He's over that. He's already looking like 3 people deep. And the question is, how does the mind do that? How does it know where to look based on what you're trying to do, right? Now, even something like making a pot of tea is actually really complicated, so I'm just going to break the task down a little bit so that we can look at how this process works. But let's say that our overall goal is to make tea, right, or to drink tea. We can break this down into kind of just very coarse goals. You need to reach for the teapot, you need to grab the teapot, you need to pour the tea, or something like that. And then again, you can kind of zoom in and you can ask, okay, what does it take to grab a teapot? Well, you have to open your palm, you have to look at the handle, and you have to close your palm. And then again, if you get to the fine-grained goal, the question that we have right in front of us is, how do you know when to look at the right thing at the right time? And so while you're kind of looking, how do you know to look at the handle rather than the lid, rather than the nose of the teapot or something like that, right? Now, it looks like the way that this works in the mind, at least minds like ours, is that eye movement is driven by reward and by value. And so here we're going to want to introduce some kind of preliminary definitions where reward is going to mean something like the intrinsic desirability of a given stimulus. So if you're thirsty or you need caffeine, then drinking tea is going to be intrinsically desirable for you, right? Or drinking a glass of water is going to be intrinsically desirable for you. But there are lots of things that you need to do on the way that aren't intrinsically rewarding, aren't intrinsically desirable, that you still need to do, steps you need to take in order to get to the T. And that's where the notion of value comes in. Value is kind of a placeholder that it looks like the mind assigns to states that then have an expectation of total future reward. So just to kind of illustrate this example, as we might say, like drinking tea might be intrinsically rewarding, but there's nothing rewarding about grabbing a teapot. I mean, unless you're from like a Commonwealth country like me, like looking at a teapot is not going to be intrinsically rewarding, but it is going to be valuable because it's something that you need to do in order to have the rewarding experience drinking the tea. And the question is, how does the mind assign value, right? Something that's not rewarding, but assign value to the teapot such that you can get the thing that's rewarding, drinking the tea. Now, here's where some of the reinforcement learning comes into the picture. The idea is that the mind retroactively attributes value to states that subsequently lead to rewards. So just to kind of give you an example, here we have the idea that the tea is rewarding, but none of the preceding steps are so. And the idea is that the mind averages through experience backwards to think, hey, although I didn't have any initial expectations about this, perhaps you're a Martian and you're drinking tea for the first time, as you come to learn what the process is like, you actually attribute value backwards to states that then lead to subsequent reward. And if you've ever seen an infant, right, this is going to seem very familiar to you. They do a lot of random movement, a lot of random looking, a lot of random sounds, and what sticks then gets these value attributions backwards, right? They shake it and it has the rattling noise. It's not like they necessarily knew that was going to happen, but the rattling might be intrinsically rewarding. I don't know, babies. But then what becomes valuable is the shaking that previously had no value associated with it. And so this goes backwards as far as need be, right? This might be why someone who is really motivated to drink alcohol might see the door of the bar or see a coaster even, and already have some of those positive feelings associated with then drinking the beer. It's because the value is being attributed backwards in this way. And so the same thing happens for looking, right? Our question is, how do we know where to look? And the same process happens through sort of fixation states. We attribute value backwards to seeing the teapot. All of a sudden, you're not just British, right? All of a sudden, you find that state valuable because you know that it leads to the drinking of the tea, right? And so on and so forth. And roughly the theory goes something like this. So we have ordinal attributions of values to various fixation states, possible states that things that you could have looked at. You could have looked at the lid, you could have looked at the handle, you could have looked at the spout. But if you're in the business of grabbing it, relatively seeing the handle is going to be the most valuable. And the idea here is that that's what the kind of mechanism that the brain uses in order to guide eye movement and eye fixation. Okay, I told you this was going to be a long example, but I think it's worth kind of unpacking what's going on here, because this is a process that we can characterize here for the case of vision, but what I'm going to try and suggest throughout my talk is actually a process that is possibly ubiquitous throughout our cognitive processes. And so what we're going to want to do is take a really detailed example and then generalize it and see just how ubiquitous it is or not, right? So let's just kind of take a first pass characterization here. We want to describe what just happened to us. We can say visual fixation is modulated by the goal-dependent attributions of subjective value, which sounds kind of nasty, but really all we're saying is we're kind of biasing where we fixate, where we look, dependent on our goals, and in light of those goals, the value that we've attributed to the various possible states. Looking out the window when you're trying to pour a cup of coffee is notably not very valuable, right? And that's what happens when you spill your tea. Right, so again, we just kind of have these four parts, and the emphasis here is going to be the goal dependent. The value that you attribute to a given state depends on what you're in the business of doing. If you're trying to ignore something, by looking out the window is going to be very valuable to you. So this is this process of valuation as it relates to vision, but I want to make a broader move here. And I want to kind of develop a general characterization, and I then want to see how prevalent it is in our general cognitive processing. So here we can kind of take another step back and generalize and say the valuation is something like response biasing, right? So the modulation of either our bodily or cognitive processes, or bodily and neural processes, conditional on the subpersonal attribution of context-dependent or goal-dependent subjective value. So again, it depends on what you're doing, what you're in the business of doing, or your body's in the business of doing. And then we can attribute that value to either exteroceptive or interoceptive stimuli, which just is to say, the mind, it looks like, can attribute value not just to the teapot or the tea, but to objects, right? That's Camilo Padoa-Schioppa's work here at WashU. Or actions, right? His opponents in the debate, people think that attributing value to actions is actually the base unit of what the mind is doing. Or state action pairs, right? What do you do and when do you do it? But also, interestingly, the mind, it seems, probably can attribute value to internal states. So states of feeling happy or homeostatic states or abstract ideas, things like money, things like moral concepts, things like beauty. Right, we can attribute value both to things out there in the world and to within our bodies, within our minds, but also to abstract concepts. So that's the general characterization I'm going to work with. This is something that I just kind of, like I said, I want to put on the table and see what you think of that idea. And then we want to see, okay, how much can this concept do for us in other questions that we might have in philosophy. Now, just a quick note here, this is a general characterization, right? In this respect, my talk is going in the, it's like the train is going in the wrong direction from what Russ was trying to argue for yesterday, where as I took it, Russ was saying, look, we should move, or maybe just the sciences naturally do move away from natural language towards formal characterizations, and here the move is the opposite. Right? We already have these beautiful computational approaches. Like, why in the world would you possibly go backwards and do this? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one is more principled, and that's to say that I think it might be reasonable to say the mind is in the business of valuation without necessarily hitching our wagon exclusively to reinforcement learning. So I want to take a kind of a big tent approach. Because predictive processing is so popular in philosophy, I think it's reasonable to say that the mind is in the business of valuation, and reinforcement learning does a really elegant job of formally characterizing valuation. But there are other approaches out there that at least kind of come close. And the ones that I want to describe here, particularly Sam Gershman's Kalman-Tiede algorithm, which is actually a hybrid, and Chandra will recognize this, a hybrid of kind of Kalman filtering and the temporal difference learning algorithm, which tries to kind of get the best of both the Bayesian world and the reinforcement learning framework. And so I'm trying to kind of be open-minded about which ones, and I don't particularly want to make the claim for reinforcement learning. I want to make the claim for valuation. That still doesn't explain the commitment to natural language. Because philosophy. I want philosophers to kind of have an idea of what's going on here, and then if they find that motivating, right, which will depend on how well I pitch it, then they may be moved to look at some of the formal frameworks. Or some people who are already inclined that way will, of course, look at the frameworks anyway. But I'm kind of trying to keep a broader approach, and that's why I think this sort of maybe retrograde move might be important, or at least a step that we have to take. So, valuation.
I don't know if it's too early to ask a question.
No, it's never too early.
I love the way that you're characterizing RL, and I'm going to borrow some of this language when I try to portray some of the framework. But my question is really, would a philosopher, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a philosopher that is well-versed in traditional theory and maybe contemporary literature but hasn't read any RL, might they respond that, of course, we're already committed to the idea that the mind has kind of pro-attitude states in which we have mental representations of the goodness or badness of actions or outcomes. You might use the term desirability. Watson uses the term valuation system. So, and they would also...
I'm totally listening.
Oh, okay. And they would also say that the idea that the mind, having observed the goodness and badness of outcomes, would retroactively propagate some of that information to previous. They may not immediately say, oh, of course that's true, but they might say, of course, broadly that's what I was committed to. So I guess the worry is that this formalizes something that they already knew or was on the tip of their tongue and just needed to be made explicit.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a bit of a detour, and the time gods will just do to me what they will. Because that's a question that I had as well, right? Look, we have notions of desire already out there. I pick desires and emotions because I think they're already doing a ton of this work, and you might, as Tim sometimes does, say to me, like, this is just a desire, right, for example. So let's just take the notion of desire, right? So, and I can make a similar argument for emotion, but for the sake of time, I won't. The first thing I would say to these people who are saying, it's just on the tip of my tongue, but I haven't articulated, I'd be like, yes, get on the bus. Get on the bus with me, right? And tell me what your tip of the tongue articulation can bring to my view and what mine can bring to yours. And again, I want it to be quite inclusive. So I would actually view that as a positive thing. We're all kind of trying to tap something that we take to be in the mind, and we don't necessarily have to take my characterization, although obviously that would be awesome. This is something that philosophers have for sure been interested in since, I mean, Socrates talks about this roughly. But it kind of goes in and out of vogue in our ontologies, and I think in our current one, it's not well represented. And so just a specific case that I want to take here is desires. So desires are things like wanting food or shelter, love, self-fulfillment, and so on. I don't know if you can see the bottom. It's not that important. The idea is just that this is like a folk psychological, a personal level folk psychological construct. And what you might take some philosophers, maybe like me, as doing is giving the essence of what's going on in a desire. That's how Tim describes it, right? He says, I want to give the essence of what a desire is. All right, somebody's calling me to tell me to vote, which you can't do. So Tim says to have a desire is to have an intrinsic positive desire. A P, that's to use the capacity to perceptually or cognitively represent that P is to constitute P as a reward. Right, so Tim's tapping into exactly the same reinforcement learning framework. Isn't he just kind of capturing the same construct that I'm after? You can kind of look at these and say, hey, these look pretty similar actually. And even what you might want to do if you're so inclined is to substitute the process of valuation back into Tim's definition of a desire, right? That's something we can argue about, whether we want to do that or not. Again, I think that's a question of, can we, just to be clear what happened there, here's kind of a medium level description of what a desire is. So it's no longer sort of the personal level kind of folk characterization. What Tim takes himself to be doing is to be giving the essence of a desire in terms of reward learning mechanisms. And I'm saying, okay, that sounds pretty similar to what I'm doing in terms of valuation, so we could potentially substitute or kind of synthesize our views there, but it's still not a desire. That's what I want to drive.
I don't know if this matters for you, but in neuroscience, there's emerged this story about how basically you can dissociate wanting and liking, right? And dopamine seems to map along with wanting, not
but not liking. Right. So the work of Kent Berridge, right? And that's going to be really important. You could even just say something simpler and say, look, desires are personal level phenomena. Valuation is this personal process, which is like sneakily put into the definition there for precisely that reason. But I think you can say something else, which is that even if Tim is right, that valuation, or on his words, reward learning, is the essence of a desire. Not all valuational processes, as we saw with the example of looking, are cases of desire, right? So it's not a one-to-one mapping. It may be that valuation is the essence of desire, but it may also be a core component of other processes that we surely do not want to call desires. And the same thing will kind of happen with the emotion, right? This idea of appraisal is super influential in a lot of componential theories of emotion. Even if you say something like valuation just is appraisal, described in other words, emotions are made up of these other components, and so again, valuation may be a part of emotion, but it's not the same thing. That's the kind of moves that I would want to make there. So that was kind of a long answer, but does that help?
Definitely.
Okay, now I'm gonna graciously, I'm sure there's a better way of doing this. Try and defend the place of valuation, right? I'm trying to put something on the table that we can all kind of feast on. And the question is kind of, what do we want to do with this? Some of you will find this like, meh, sure, you can have it. Hopefully someone will say, hey, this can be kind of useful, and the question is, how useful is it? What I want to do here is just kind of give you a range of options. I'm going to suggest where I kind of sit on this issue, but I think, again, it's an empirical question for reasons that you'll see in a moment, exactly what place valuation should have in the traditional philosophical cognitive ontology. And so I'm going to try and give you a very weak claim, go all the way to a super strong claim that you might see kind of in predictive processing, and then see where we might land. So the super weak claim, which I call the milquetoast claim, is just that valuation plays some role in some of our cognitive processes. And I take that to be already established just by something like looking at the role of dopamine, right? Or liking and wanting, or Ken Berridge's work, or something like that. Or even just kind of this example that we've seen with eye movement. I'm pretty sure philosophers would be willing to grant valuation in kind of decision making. They might be surprised to see it in eye movement, or not, depending on kind of where you're coming from. But if you accept either one of these cases, then you're already willing to grant the milquetoast claim that, like, sure, I think valuation has a place in the cognitive ontology, I just think it's like trivial and I don't care. So that's like the weakest possible claim that you can have. The mild claim says something a little bit stronger. It says that valuation plays a necessary role in some of our cognitive processes, and I'd say that this takes everything on board from the milquetoast claim plus a couple of extra kind of requirements. The first thing that you would want to show here is that it's necessary insofar as if valuation breaks down, then you're going to see kind of stereotypical breakdowns in some of our cognitive processes, and that's exactly, for example, what computational psychiatry is in the business of showing, right? So this project roughly says something like, when your valuational mechanisms break down, you might experience something like depression. All of a sudden you undervalue your alternatives and you're no longer very motivated to pursue things, right? And you get kind of interesting splitting of the kind that Carl was talking about earlier, where we used to associate depression with sadness. If you take this approach, maybe depression is actually about absence of motivation and sadness is a separate thing, or you get kind of interesting analyses of dysfunction via evaluation. You can do a similar analysis of something like addiction, where addiction is a hijacking, right, of your evaluational systems with kind of predictable outcomes. So again, if you want to say something is necessary, then you're going to want to show that if it breaks down, you're going to have consequences, and that's kind of roughly the project there. My own work, as Joe mentioned, has been kind of different. My work doesn't really show that valuation plays a necessary role in our cognitive processes in this dysfunction sense, but it has tried to show in a kind of piecemeal approach that there are cognitive kind of puzzles, or there are puzzling phenomena in our cognitive processes that we can do a much better job of explaining if we take something like valuation on board. So all of a sudden, weakness of will is not that mysterious if you have a model like this rather than a belief desire model in which it's like utterly paradoxical, like headbangingly, pointlessly paradoxical. And all of that goes away if you just take a different approach. Similarly, binocular rivalry, I've argued that we have that nice paper from Howie that says something like the evasion approach solves all of our questions about binocular rivalry. I argue that it doesn't. It doesn't explain perceptual dominance in binocular rivalry, but valuation does. And other work that I've done with Colin, puzzles in cognitive control, puzzles in moral constraint, that seem really mysterious unless you take a valuation-based approach. So I've tried to argue necessary, maybe in the sense of functioning, right, or necessary in the sense of useful in terms of explaining. The moderate claim just takes the mild claim on board and adds that valuation plays a necessary role, but that it's also ubiquitous, right? So that something along the lines of vision, right, we didn't expect to see valuation playing such a strong role in something that's basic as sensation or perception. And so it tries to kind of up the ante and say not only is it necessary and really important, it's actually ubiquitous and can help us understand all kinds of things like perception, which we didn't think before. Now, the burden of proof there is going to be something like the mild claim plus evidence of ubiquity, which is where things get ugly, because the way that you show ubiquity is through an inductive argument. So you're just going to pile evidence onto people, which is in fact exactly what I'm going to do to you. Not really, right? I'm kind of not interested in making that move, but that's what would be required. I would have to show you that valuation is involved in sensations, usually vision, perception, cognition, right? This is where the bulk of the work has been done. So valuation plays a role in assessing risk, uncertainty, and decision-making. That's where it all really kind of took off. Attention, cognitive control, social cognition, moral cognition, blah, blah, blah. Right, this is why inductive arguments are unpleasant, because you have to do something like this, and that's just like not a fun thing to do to people. But we could make that claim, I think. Now, just to kind of chart out the territory, and this is the last couple of things I'll say, we can make an even stronger claim for valuation, which would be to say something like, valuation plays a necessary role in all cognitive processes. I think that is pretty hella strong and pretty hard to defend, but I just want to show you what it would take. Here, an inductive argument won't do the trick anymore, right? You're going to have to show why this ought to be the case. And so here's just a sketch. You have to say something like all cognitive processes, although they do very different things, have a problem in common, and that problem is that they all have to kind of wire up and learn how to do what they do by interacting with the environment, right? So you have to make that claim. It's not clear whether you successfully could make that claim. Some reinforcement learners want to. Then you have to show that valuation is an optimal solution to this problem. That's probably actually the less difficult of the two, although they're both hard. And then you have to kind of make some inferences there to say something like, hey, our processes are actually optimal, and since this is an optimal solution, we have a good reason to expect valuation to play a really important role in all of our cognitive processes. That's personally not a move that I'm comfortable making yet. You might want to make a weaker move to say something like, look, even if this is an ideal solution to some of these problems, and I don't think, right, like Julia Staffel, right, I don't think that we're actually optimal in any sense, maybe like sort of Aristotle's archer, if I know what the optimal solution is, I can at least kind of hover around and figure out, okay, what are we doing, even if the assumption isn't that what we're doing is optimal. But again, I think this one's hard to defend. And then lastly, just to clarify, this is the kind of claim that I think, or that I know that predictive processors are making. They say that predictive processing is a grand unifying theory of the mind, which would be to say something like that it plays a necessary and sufficient role for understanding our cognitive processes. To be clear, under no circumstances am I making that claim. I don't think any valuationist is making that claim. I just kind of want to show you the span of things, the span of strength that you could make there. Where I think we are, and this is something that we can talk about, is this moderate claim. I think we're leaning towards being able to say, look, this is important and it's ubiquitous. And again, it's going to be an inductive argument, so it's just going to depend on what you each take to be satisfying in that regard. So just to wrap up, a couple of things that I want to say, kind of, okay, what does this mean? So going back to this picture, right, at the end of the day, I'm hoping to pitch something like this, not to those converted already towards reinforcement learning, but to someone like a philosopher who might be interested in perception. What can we draw from this, right? What I've tried to do is just characterize valuation in a way that people can take on board, and I've tried to at least sketch what that place might be. But I think, for example, one thing that you might think is that even if you just take the utterly milquetoast claim on board, then you might think that valuation deserves some place at the table, right? It's a construct that at least merits some kind of tiny, tiny piece of real estate at the table, and then the valuationist can kind of work from there. And you don't have to require a lot of, you don't have to take many of the strong things on board to think something like this. And so it's like, okay, hey, grant me access, right, to the traditional philosophical ontology. I think if you take on the moderate view, and this would require some spelling out, but that's a different talk. If you take something like the moderate view on board, then you start to change the picture of what you might think the mind is doing. Right, you think that the mind isn't just in the business of knowing the world and telling me what color it is and telling me what things taste like, but it's constantly in the business of assessing the world in terms of what I'm trying to do. And so in fact, what I see is conditional on what I'm trying to do. What I believe is conditional on things I already believe. And so ideas like cognitive penetration and kind of issues of like bias can start to kind of take on a more global role if you take on something like this moderate view, because it suggests that valuation is constantly shaping how we look at the world. And that's actually my last slide, so I will take your questions now.
I'm a Buddhist meditator, and I study Buddhist fundamental psychology. They consider valuation, as best I can understand what you're saying and my understanding of Catholicism, they consider it normative. And the second interline or whatever step in perceptual processing. You cannot have perceptual processing without valuation. The question is, do you think the increase in reaction time in the screw test incongruent is a valuation issue?
I think it's a byproduct of valuation, yes. Valuation isn't the only contributing factor there, but I think it's part of the story. And that's not what I want to do. Yeah, so I do think it's part of the story. Regarding the Buddhist tradition, yeah, I mean, I think there's a strong alignment there that I find kind of encouraging, if only just to sort of see how it's worked out in a different philosophical tradition. Because I think getting it on the table is the first step. Working out what it means is kind of, that would be the goal, right? And it's nice to see, you have to get it on the table first, which is annoying. But it's nice to see it really worked out over centuries, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism. Russ, and then Joe?
I'm trying to understand the project. And I'm gonna reframe it in a way that's gonna sound diminutive. I don't really mean it to, I don't mean to be insulting, but I'm just saying it in kind of the most many way I can. It's like, philosophers have this incredibly oversimplified 1962 view of the structure of information processing in the mind, and now you want to add one more thing that psychologists have talked about for 50 years to that really oversimplified ontology of the mind. Did I miss something?
Yeah, that's not, yeah, I thought a lot about how to pitch this framework, and it's challenging. Because ideally what one would do is sort of take the approach that you took, right, and just say like, screw all this, right, let's go computational. That I think has been privately my approach, right? I had the sort of the advantage or the disadvantage of not having a traditional philosophical training, kind of the way that most people do, so I didn't actually have to deal with this. I didn't have to deal with like philosophical folk psychology until it was like way too late. And then I was like, what is this, right? People who know me have like seen this happen live. So why backtrack? Because you have to talk to the discipline where it is, I think. I think that's what I've learned. You can't just be like, folk psychology is stupid, even though you may occasionally feel that. Because first of all, I think that's not true. If you spend some time with it, it would be silly to throw it all away. But even if you want to change it, you have to actually start with the thing you want to change. That's some sort of like omen. It's like, that's folk psychology, right? That's like making that sound like, I'm dying. Yeah, so it's purely pragmatic. And the goal would be to move it forward. But it's not to say to take a step back, but I think to engage with the kinds of interesting questions that you want to, you have to kind of take it in the language that it's currently in. And again, I think it can be piecemeal. It just depends on the audience. So sometimes you want to kind of go to the received cognitive ontology, to the very traditional philosophy. Sometimes you can just be like, hey, let's look at this variation on the Kalman TV or something like that. But I think if you want to make the kind of move that Amy Clark made for predictive processing, notice that he too pitches it in terms of sensation, perception, cognition, and action. And I don't think that's because he thinks that's how the mind is actually carved up. That's because that's who he wants to talk to. But I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, because you might be like, all of that is well and good, but still don't do that like slap, 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 right? I'm genuinely of two minds. I don't know what the best approach is.
You know, I think it comes down to what your goals are, right? So yeah, if your goals are to talk to people who have this ontology in mind and extend it, then I think that's perfectly fine. It's just, it's so at odds with, I think, the way that cognitive neuroscientists think about what the cognitive ontology should look like.
Right.
That it almost makes it seem like talking between those disciplines would be impossible.
Yeah, it does feel that way a lot of the time. But if you think that, so if you're interested in perception because you want to talk to the epistemologist, the normative questions, right? Then you've got to find the traction. And if you want to think about valuation because you want to talk about the moral implications, which would be broadly my goal, then you've got to talk to the people who kind of like own the real estate, or at least someone in my position does. And then maybe one day I will like break free.
You will be the owner of the
yeah, I'm like not holding my breath, but like that would be the vision. So yeah, I totally take your point and I feel it like daily in a very personal way. Joe?
Yeah, so I was thinking of, so in Roediger's Rethinking Implicit Memory paper, he talks about how some forms of memory seem to be a kind that refers to a system, right? So there's sort of an independent system for episodic memory. And in that paper, he seems to express, I don't want to say how he lands because he himself says stuff back and forth, but he's a bit sort of skeptical about implicit memory as something that we have to include in our ontology because it seems more like a feature that many systems have than a genuine system. So just sort of like anything that can be primed, right, exhibits implicit memory, whether or not it's happening in your ivory plexus or whether it's happening in your semantics. And I was curious about, so it leads to two questions about the relationship between systems and kinds that come up from your talk. One is just something I don't know about, but is the claim that you think comes from the empirical literature that there's a system, say the dopaminergic pathways of the midbrain, that does valuation, and all of these, and that it serves as like some kind of way station for all the sundry cognitive processes that you think involve valuation, or do you think the literature says, look, there are many completely, fairly separate systems of the mind, but they all have this feature, they all have embedded in their computational workings, reinforcement learning of a sort?
So I would say the former, and the neural processes. I didn't talk about the neuroscience at all. I just thought it's probably the least interesting bit of this. But I think what we can learn from that is that it is relatively centralized but diffused. So it's not a way station that everything has to pass through. It's kind of a process that then has its tentacles into a lot of systems, if that makes sense. So there's nothing centralized, nothing has to pass through it, but it does impact a lot of various systems. Now the thing that I would say to that, the fact that valuation does, and this goes to Russ's question too, the fact that valuation has, try making a slide where you're like, I'm going to put this thing that goes through all the things into boxes, right? It's like it's like the phrenology thing. It's like you already know that what you're trying to do is not really the right vocabulary. But what I think is interesting is that if we took it one step back out and said, okay, what kind of a system is valuation? Right? Knowing that it's computationally well supported and neurally well supported, remarkably predictive, and works in creatures like us and creatures not like us. I wonder if you could start to look at that and say, I wonder if other parts of the new ontology will also have contours like this. It's not in a place, right? It does something that then contributes to lots of other things, where I think valuation might be the thing that actually makes it through lots of cognitive ontological revisions, but it doesn't fit into some of the current kind of boxes that we try to put it in, for better or for worse. That might just be overly optimistic, like maybe it just doesn't fit, it doesn't have to be visionary as a result, but that might be a thing that you might think, that if we take the computational approach, you'll find that the constructs don't fit into the traditional boxes, but that doesn't mean that it's in the wrong there. Does that help?
Yeah.
To the broader sense? Okay, you're looking very frowny.
No, not frowny at all, actually. I was just going to say that it's, sometimes people talk about canonical neural computations, right? And I was thinking whether reinforcement learning could be one, and the way people sometimes talk about canonical neural computations is sort of like it crops up everywhere, but it's not unified. It's not there's a normalization system in the brain, and everything taps into that. It's just a lot of brain processes use that. Anyway.
Yeah, when I was like freaking out about how to make the ubiquity claim, a suggestion that someone had was like, well, look, just like show that everything's connected to the basal ganglia. And I was like, I don't really think that's how I want to go about this. But I think that's the kind of answer that you might get if you're asking about like, is it like realized in lots of different locations, or does it kind of spread its tentacles? I don't know if I find that a persuasive way of making that claim, but I think that's the structure. I think Susan was next, and
Yeah,
then
I'm struggling to try and voice my question. So I'll just tell you the question and understand that I haven't put it in a way that like lines up with what you've been talking about. I just wonder about, I mean, how is this like or not like interests, and what might the connection be to instincts? And I'm thinking of things like there are dogs with prey drive that have never been allowed to get near, say, a bunny rabbit, but if they see anything white that looks like a bunny rabbit, you know, seems like they're pretty valuable. There's some valuation going on there. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, if you're just talking about reinforcement learning, or if you're thinking about, well, I'm just wondering what role instincts might have in this story.
okay, I'm just writing it down.
And I realize I haven't put it in a way that might connect with what you're saying.
No, I think it does. So just regarding the question of interest, I think interests and preferences, likes, dislikes, are just at a different level, but I think, again, I'm kind of a convert, but I think valuation is going to play a role in something like the interest. In terms of instincts, one of the sort of more formal representations in the reinforcement learning framework is this Pavlovian learning algorithm, which does seem to have like strong evolutionary roots, but isn't instrumental. It's just a stimulus response. And so it does seem like there are some things that, I don't want to say pre-programmed, but that we have at least strong tendencies. And the idea is something like we approach rewarding things and we withdraw from aversive ones. And then that kind of basic architecture gets expanded through the process of evaluation, so that we attribute it not just to white things, but to the park or getting into the car. Like everybody has the dog that like gets super excited when they get in the car because they know that the car leads to the park and the park leads to the white thing, and then that leads to like feasting on prey. So
things that they've never been allowed to experience. So
because some of them are like snakes, like we all have that.
Cats and cucumbers.
Yeah, I don't know how to account for the content of those like evolved memories. Like that's a terrible description. I don't know how the content of that works, but I think the process is valuational. It's just hard to say how it is that the snake part, or the white fluffy, got into that. But yeah, that's a good question that I just don't have the answer to.
Am I remembering correctly that you put value at the subpersonal level?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because we have values like you value Van Halen, or whatever. Back to the earlier example of the M&Ms, I was like, I was just gonna pick something neutral, which failed. Let's say this. I can't value Van Halen because I don't know what that is. And we have these values, and that's actually a challenge back to the question of the philosophical literature, right? How do you kind of like park your project in a parking lot that already has something like the word value in it, right? Like Ruth Chang works on values and incommensurate values and things like that. Carefully, but it's a different, it's trying to account maybe for how we have values, or it's at least part of the story of how we have values. It just shares the same word, and I realize that that's problematic, but the reason I'm sticking with valuation is because there is this huge research program already that does use reward and valuation, and so I'm like willing to kind of take the heat for this subpersonal personal difference than I am to think of like a weird word to say valuation. So it's not perfect, but it's a decision that I had to make to stick with valuation. I do think it's kind of intuitive, right? People like weigh their options. Well, what they're doing there is they're valuing their options, right? And so I think I don't put much stock into like the bodily metaphor literature, but it does seem that valuing is quite intuitive to people, and what they do is they have these sort of assignations, and so that's why I've kept it, even though there is this capital like V value at the personal level.
Well, part of what I'm thinking is that the philosophical ontology that you're fitting into everything else is at the personal level. So and then you're adding this subpersonal component to it, which seems like a little bit odd, and it at least seems like you would want it to be disjunctive, because we do value things.
Yeah,
at
so
the personal level.
and
so-
preferences, right? So
Yeah.
the what valuation is not list is going to be quite long. and I just didn't have enough time. But I would say something like sensation, I'm not sure, is any more personal level than valuation is. It can be quite as a subpersonal process. So that's one thing that you might find weird about this ontology if you are someone like Russ. It's like, hey, does it bother anybody that some of these things are really personal level and some of these are not? And I agree that valuation kind of shares that problem. But I want to keep it subpersonal precisely because I want to keep it separate from preference, from value, from interest, things like that. And that will require like a careful compare and contrast in each case to show why valuation is probably involved in that, but isn't the same thing as value or something like that. Yeah, but that's like, it's a big task, but I see what you're saying. And then Ron?
I wonder, so it does sound ridiculous to say that in this day and age, we should have a cognitive ontology with beliefs and desires. But I hate to defend the philosopher here, but I mean, the claim has always been that somehow there are kind of belief-like states that have the job of, this is all parts of this are controversial, that represent the world, and desire-like states that the world must in some sense fit based on our actions and things like that. So that beliefs and desires are distinct existences. That's the core of the belief-desire claim.
Mm-hmm.
But like Al Neely is a classic belief-desire theorist about agency, admits there are lots of different kinds of desires, calm desires, violent desires, conscious desires, unconscious desires. He allows all sorts of science to populate the mind with desires of various kinds. So without defending Neely's overall kind of methodological way of doing studies of agency, what you would say is, thank you for all this information. There is now valuation desire in my ontology. It might be subpersonal. It plays a role in other more conscious desire-like states. So he would still be a belief-desire theorist at the end of it, and would permissively just kind of take on board anything that you say. I really genuinely feel most philosophers of the BD belief-desire bent would respond in that kind of way. So I'm curious how you might get some traction.
Yeah, so one nice thing about giving a talk kind of at like your home institution is like people see you over time. And so I feel like one of those memes of like what you look like when you submit your manuscript and then what you look like when the manuscript gets accepted. You know, like you look young and happy and then like you're super tired and haggard. I feel like that's where I am with the belief desire model in the following way. I came out because I wasn't trained in it. I was like, what the hell is this? And I was like, this just doesn't carve nature disjoints or whatever, and I had all these problems with it. And I felt like some of the paradoxes that come out of it, his will, synchronic self-control, could have just more elegant explanations if we got rid of it. And that's kind of been the body of my work, sort of piecemeal approach of like, hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? But something interesting has happened in this process, and it's, I think, the right thing, which is that I've also come to value the belief desire framework in some respects. And so some of my recent work is much more conciliatory towards this, or kind of ecumenical, to use Carl's approach, which is like, look, this isn't my cup of tea, but I see why it's a useful cup of tea for someone, and I think we can coexist. Where the coexistence is going to kind of maybe have pressure put on it are cases like weakness of will, or cases where the belief desire model says it's doing something special and it's doing the best job. And that's, I think, a place where valuation can come in and be like, I don't know, I can take all of your concerns on board about rationality or about cognitive control or about domain of self or all the kind of high-minded concepts that we associate with the belief desire model and that we want to keep because we are philosophers. Say, hey, we can actually keep all those and solve some puzzles for you on the valuation framework. And so Al Neely, in my experience, will not be convinced by that, but that's okay, because maybe somebody else will, right? And so his solutions are out there, and they have some strengths and they have some weaknesses, and mine will be just alongside that and have different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think that's like an okay state of affairs, at least for me. I'm old and wizened, and like I'm no longer like I hate, it's just I've just changed my view. I think Ron had his hand up next. scared, and then Nick.
Thanks. So I had Chandra's sort of meta thought that I didn't think. Well, I feel like there's a burden when you do interdisciplinary work, which is not just to show that this connects to that, but to show that it's somehow a difference maker. And so I'm not sure that you tried to do that. Like tried to show like if the philosophers started paying attention to reinforcement learning, then they really have to change the way they're doing things. I don't think you quite made that case. That's just maybe part of the project long term. And then I just had a kind of a clarification question. So suppose I have a subtask which is instrumental to some. So I have some valuation attached to some subtask, and it's instrumental. And in one case, it's instrumental to some really rewarding outcome, and in another case, maybe with another me in another possible world, it's a subtask and it's instrumental to avoiding some really unrewarding outcome. Is the valuation attached to that subtask the same? I mean,
No, it changes. It doesn't even have to be you in a different universe. It could be you at a different time. So, do you eat meat?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so steak looks really good to you at 8 p.m. Looks horrible to you at 8 a.m., right? And that's okay, because this is a continual online computation of value.
Yeah, so that's not what I meant. I just meant that when the same task is located as a subtask in a plan, and in one case the plan it has like this really rewarding goal, like to be some ice cream or something. And in another case the plan has this really
Horrible outcome.
well,
Like,
it
you're
has
going
this
to break
goal
it
of
out.
avoiding a horrible outcome, like avoiding burning my hand or something. But the same action might be
So you're talking
located
about,
in one case in this plan,
turning on
and
the
another
faucet
case
or
this plan.
something.
And so in both cases, we want to say because the plan positively modifies my behavior towards performing that sub-action, that I suppose the sub-action has a positive valuation in both cases. And I guess I was just curious if that's what you said.
So does it have a positive valuation even though it has an avoidant structure?
Even though the plan, as it were, has an avoidance structure.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. But to the first thing, I think the way to show that would be through the kind of question that Chandra was asking, right? Can it do things that we find compelling? Can it solve problems that we want to solve and we can't solve in other cases? Yeah, and I've just sort of quietly been like accumulating those in my pocket. And so what I'm trying to do is lay out the bigger case, but I think it's true that they definitely have to you need to do both of these things. And I went through this really quickly because I was kind of running out of time. That's what I take sort of that component of work to be doing. And I think what you have to do to be really persuasive is not just do it on things that you care about, like we just will, but on issues that other people care about really seriously. So that's kind of what motivated, let's say, the binocular rival, because it gets at like the perception issue, it gets at the predictive processing issue, and it gets to kind of all these things where you take a focus case and you can sort of say, hey, this is where the shift should start to happen. But I want to start developing the framework, and so that's helpful to say like, hey, probably the puzzle should be front and center if you want to like punch people with it.
You can imagine like an other universe here that's trying to present the philosophical belief desire theory to the neuroscience or the psychologist, right? And then again, it would have to be it would be like an evil twin you, but it would be right. What would be the burden on that person? What would the neuroscientist and the cognitive psychologist expect? And they would expect them to show that they are, falling short. They can't do things they want to do as well as they would be able if they took the philosophy more seriously.
Yeah, and so I think that's the kind of piecemeal approach that I've taken, but now I'm hoping to kind of start situating it. Because it turns out that's the thing people want, but they don't care about in individual moves, I think. And so it helps to have, you need both. And so this is, you guys were subjected to the trial version of the frame and so that's all. Nick, did you have a question? I don't know what time it is at all. 3 minutes. Okay, we can do this.
I'm trying to make it quick. I sort of feel compelled to say something as someone who is in the midst of working on a metaphysics of belief.
You'll notice I didn't say anything mean.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I did.
I probably did, but I'm very sensitive.
No, she did.
So I don't-
True colors.
I thought I would just try to like react to your talk in a way, because I'm not really sure what to make of it exactly. You know, I think like if you want to come to me and persuade me to take this on board, then you just like, you know, find things I worry about and persuade me that that's not going very well, blah, blah,
Right,
blah.
that's
Like,
what Ron's
you know, I'm
suggesting.
gonna go read the municipal paper later because that
Yeah,
sounds
you
really
do
interesting.
that.
And I worry about that kind of stuff, and if, you know, you can show me a way of solving the problem and I can find a way to fit that in. But I worry, like, you know, Carl asked whether this stuff is subpersonal, and to me, like, as soon as you say it is, I sort of lose my grip on how it's supposed to. My understanding of how those things relate is one where the stuff you're doing is like involved in a different kind of project, and so there are ways in which as I understand these things, it could end up helping me. There's like not many. It's very hard for it to hurt me.
And it's
as
not
I understand
intended
this.
to. It's always what they say. I wasn't trying to, yeah. Here's a case, right? So I can just because we have limited time, I just want to give you a case where, right, I think very often these projects are ships passing in the night, and that's what I'm learning to avoid, right? Or what I want to avoid. Because I think of it not as something to take down the existing views, but a tool that the existing views might be able to take on board under very particular circumstances. So the case I have in mind, you work on belief, I do not. But as I understand it, something that's important when it comes to epistemic discussions or conversations about beliefs and whether they're justified is, in some cases, sort of the role of sort of perception in the formation of beliefs or something like that, right? So I'm probably never going to come on directly to the problem of beliefs in this lifetime or any other and say, like, look, people who are interested in beliefs have to take on valuation. It's more realistic, and I think I've started to kind of chip away at that issue, that people who are interested in perception maybe should take valuation seriously, regardless of what framework they use. So I took the variational Bayes approach, but generally, if you're worried about something like bias perception, this might be a way, this could be a useful thing for you to cash out, or it could be, if it's something that if you're not taking it seriously at all, should be a worry for you. And so it's going to happen more at the level of perception and sensation than it is as something quite personal and quite normative, like belief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, like, the stuff I'm doing fits well with the talk that Carl, the second talk that Carl gave. Because in a way, there's a whole bunch of stuff I don't think my theory can explain, namely anything that ever goes wrong.
Yeah, this is
It
great.
describes what happens when things go well,
Right.
because I think that's what's essential. But all the stuff that goes badly, that's up to scientists to figure out. And I'm, you know, and at that point, if that's what's going on, I become very interested. I like learning about this stuff. But it's like it fits neatly into what I think of myself as doing, and just it's helpful. But this might then be particular to views that I have about how this is all working. But I don't. The people I know who are into belief desire stuff, I don't know. They would be like, yeah, this sounds great. I can see how to fit this in. It helps to explain, you know, how we achieve the things that we do, and also why things often go wrong.
And maybe will shape. Is that a time sign? It might shape the contours subtly of something like desires.
Possibly.
And again, if I achieve any one of the 4 things that you described, like, I'm happy. Like, I'm again not in the bomb throwing. Is that what you said? Bomb throwing business. It's like maybe the unfrazzled me way back when was like, but that's no. I mean, if we can make too tired. If I can make small adjustments and small puzzle solving cases while continuing to think about this and kind of edging it in, then like I'm happy. but I think what will be useful will be really dependent on the particular project, what level it operates in, what field of philosophy it comes from, and so on and so forth. And so it's about trying to kind of find its place, and because it's a bit at odds with lots of existing projects, it's going to be kind of this odd man out. But the task is to characterize it in a way that can make the belief desire person as unhappy or happy as it can make the cognitive ontologist or you know what I mean? Like, can we all just be unhappy at the equal level? So that's the goal.